We have a very timely and fantastic talk for you today. We'll be talking PJ Liesch, the director of the Insect Diagnostic Lab at UW-Madison, will be talking about Japanese beetles. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to PJ.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining me this afternoon on a very timely topic. Japanese beetles are one of the top insects out and about in the state at the moment, and they can feed on such a wide range of plants that they cause problems for just about any gardener out there or landscaper out there. So we're going to be talking very comprehensively today about Japanese beetle biology, and it's always important to understand their biology because that has implications and has impacts on management approaches. And then the second half of the talk is going to be very heavy in terms of management. What can you actually do in your own yard and garden to combat this particular insect? We're going to talk about a wide range of options. I don't personally endorse any particular option over another. I simply want to mention the things that are out there, and it's going to be it'll come down to personal choice in terms of what you actually do in your own yard. We'll talk about factors that affect that. Now, before I get into the guts of today's talk, I do want to mention that when it comes to Japanese beetles, there are an awful lot of myths and misunderstandings and misconceptions out there. And if you go online onto gardening message boards and say, hey, I've got Japanese beetle, how can I control them? You're going to hear about everything under the sun. Homemade do-it-yourself remedies and that sort of thing. What I want to focus on today, though, are approaches that have been backed up with scientific data to actually support that they will work. And so throughout the talk, I'm going to use this icon here, this little Japanese beetle with a flag, to kind of cue you in on some of these common myths or misunderstandings or misconceptions to bring your attention to those particular things. One other thing I'll mention, I want you to be cautious of what are called illusions of causality. This is essentially the notion that correlation does not necessarily mean causation, and you can do something in your yard and it might seem to work, but the only way to know if a given management approach actually works is to do it in a controlled scientific study with lots of replication, perhaps doing it over multiple years to see if it actually works. I will say right off the bat, there are products out there that are sold and used and they get a lot of hype, but it turns out there's very little science backing them. And in some cases, the science actually says they don't work or they cause more harm than good. And we're going to be talking about those because those happen to revolve around some very common topics, things like traps and some of the other things related to Japanese beetle management. So just be aware, I'll be using this icon throughout the talk today. Now, first, an introduction. Right off the bat, what is Japanese beetle? It's an invasive, non-native scare beetle from Japan, and it can be found throughout much of the Japanese archipelago as far north as the northern island of Hokkaido, which happens to be a fairly cold part of the planet. Similar latitudes to us, they do have some snowy winters there, so it's an insect that's very well suited for our part of the planet. This is also a pest that feeds on a very, very wide range of plants, over 300 different types of plants from close to 80 different plant families. So this thing can almost nibble on everything under the sun, so to speak. It is a very, very destructive pest. And the latest figure I could find, although this monetary figure is many years old at this point, but they're estimated to cause close to $500 million in damage every year. Now, these days, that number is actually probably higher than that, but Japanese beetle can be a very destructive pest. Of course, they'll feed on garden vegetables, they'll feed on landscape plants, they feed in commercial nurseries, but they can also be very problematic for farmers and vineyard managers and fruit growers and things like that. So they can be a very, very damaging insect. Now, one of the first kind of misconceptions out there is actually, I get a lot of interactions with the general public and folks will mix up Japanese beetles with this insect, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. And I'll get calls during the winter months saying, I've got Japanese beetles in my house. And I think to myself, wow, if you had Japanese beetles in your house, that's a really interesting scenario because that doesn't, hold up with their physiology and life cycle or anything like that. But what folks do is I think they mixed up these multicolored Asian lady beetle, which is also from Asia, with the Japanese beetle just because of the similarities in their name. Multicolored Asian lady beetles are true lady beetles. They're outside feeding on aphids. That's a species that likes to sneak in your house in the fall. You may see them during the winter months, but the Japanese beetle here on the left is a true significant plant pest. Now, I just mentioned that Japanese beetle isn't native to the US. It came from Japan, of course, and it arrived in the United States in the early 1900s, and it was first documented in New Jersey in 1916. However, we think it was actually introduced about 5 or 6 years before that in the soil of a shipment of Japanese irises. So it came from the native range Japan, introduced in the soil of nursery stock into that part of the US. The reason we think that that is the case, there is a really important piece of legislation called the Plant Quarantine Act in 1912. That was basically a law that said the government could inspect nursery stock for potentially invasive insects. And so after that point, inspections were going on by the government, organizations like USDA. But prior to that point, it was a little bit of the Wild West out there. Folks were just moving plants around. There were probably invasive insects and diseases and stuff like that that just flew under the radar until they became established. So 1916 was the first year we documented this insect, but it was probably there 5 or 6 years before that. And one other misconception about this one, sometimes folks think that Japanese beetles were deliberately introduced to North America. They were not. It was an accidental introduction in the soil of nursery stock. Now let's look to today's situation. So fast forward a little bit. This is the current distribution map of Japanese beetles. So the states that are shaded in dark green, that's where we generally have infestations of this insect. So of course, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, that's really the epicenter. That's where this insect first got into the country. But over time, over the course of several decades, it has moved its way west. And so the Midwest has very heavy presence of Japanese beetles in our area. I will also point out, though, that there are some factors that affect the distribution of this insect in the U.S. Places like the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, there have been some detections there, but they don't have the problems that we do because they have much drier climates, other than perhaps in areas where you have lots of irrigated turf grass, so urban areas. I will also point out that on the map, places like Florida, Louisiana aren't shaded in. Essentially, it's too hot down there for them. They just don't do as well. They do better in kind of these temperate climates. So latitudes similar to Wisconsin, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and so on. A couple other things to point out with this map. Notice that the West Coast doesn't really have any problems with Japanese beetles, at least according to this map. However, this insect, because it can feed on such a wide range of plants, poses significant risk to agriculture industry on the West Coast. Think of California with the tree fruit and wine industry with all those vineyards. If this insect became established in a place like California, it would be devastating to that area. Same kind of thing with places like Oregon and Washington, where we grow a lot of tree fruit as well. I will say there have been introductions of this insect. They can get moved with nursery stock or moved in cargo planes and things like that. And so the Western states, they do a lot of monitoring because they do not want this insect to become established. But at the moment, it's primarily a problem in the Midwest and the Eastern US. Now, you may be wondering, if they aren't native to Wisconsin and other parts of the Eastern US, how have they done so well here? Well, there's really several reasons for that. First of all, they came from similar latitudes on the planet. A lot of the Japanese archipelago is similar latitudes to us, so that makes sense. They also feed on an extremely broad range of plants. So imagine a hypothetical situation. Imagine we had an insect that could only feed on palm trees. And if that insect were introduced to Wisconsin, it would basically fall flat on its face. It wouldn't have any food plants to feed on because we don't have palm trees here. However, Japanese beetle feeds on hundreds of different types of plants. So pretty much anywhere it ends up on the planet, it's probably going to have some type of plant that it can feed on and survive on. So that very broad host plant feeding range really helps them out, and it makes them a good invasive species in that regard. They're also very mobile and relatively long-lived. The adults can fly long distances. Now, on a day-to-day basis, adult Japanese beetles might fly in the range of a couple hundred yards potentially, but we do know in some situations they'll fly much farther than that. They easily can fly 5 miles or further, and that's been documented in some of the scientific literature. And also the adult Japanese beetles are long-lived. They can live for a month to month and a half, maybe a little bit longer than that in some cases. So they're long-lived insects and can cause a lot of damage over the course of several weeks to months. And then last but not least, they're easily transported in pretty much all their life stages. So we can have the larvae or grubs in the soil or pupae in the soil of, say, potted nursery plants, and those get moved around the planet or moved around the US, and you could potentially move this insect. The adults are also easily transported as well. We have cases where adult Japanese beetles have gotten into cargo planes. Those cargo planes then land in California or Portland, Oregon, and the beetles leave, and we have issues in those areas. So some of the Western states have a lot of monitoring programs in place specifically around airports because that's a route of introduction. So these are several reasons why Japanese beetle is such a major invasive threat. Now let's look a little bit closer to home. In Wisconsin, what's the distribution like? Well, if you live in the southern half of the state, Japanese beetle is really pretty well established. And we had our first reports in Wisconsin spanning back several decades ago. But in about the 1990s or so, we really started getting some heavy infestations in parts of Wisconsin. Couple of other things I'll point out about Wisconsin is that this insect, because it's not native to our area, it hasn't reached every spot on the map yet. And even in southern Wisconsin, there are locations where sometimes Japanese beetle just hasn't gotten to a given city or town or rural area. And then all of a sudden it shows up and it's new and you haven't dealt with it before. So I'm guessing there may be some folks on the webinar today that may be in that situation. So most of southern Wisconsin, it's pretty well established, but we're also seeing it get footholds in northern Wisconsin. And there may be a couple reasons for this. One thing personally I wonder about, I've been going up to the northern part of the state most of my life, so over 30 years. And over the last couple decades, you look at what's going on in Northwoods, a lot of vacation homes are getting put in. And what if folks want to do, they want their yard to look like their home back here in southern Wisconsin or elsewhere. They want that nice lush green lawn. Well, Japanese beetles love lawns. So you go into the northern part of the state, you cut down the trees that were there and you put in turf grass, you're really setting the stage potentially for them. So over the last decade or so, we're starting to see them creep their way northward and get some footholds. We see them now up into Oneida County near Minocqua area. I get a lot of reports from that part of the state. We've had documented cases up in Vilas County as well. I have had colleagues spot them up in Marquette, Michigan. And last summer, we had a report from Bayfield County, which is as far north as you can get in Wisconsin. So if you're in northern Wisconsin, you maybe haven't seen this one yet, but it is slowly but surely making its way northward. Now let's look at the life cycle of this insect. So if you think of 4th of July like me, you think of picnics and fireworks. If it were a typical year, this year was different because of COVID. But also right around 4th of July is when Japanese beetles are emerging as adults. So the first couple of adults, I usually hear reports in maybe late June, but it's really about 4th of July, first couple weeks in July, that we get a lot of adult emergence. And that's when they start feeding, but they're also mating. Those females are laying eggs. The eggs hatch, and then we get our larval stage, which we call white grubs. And I'll talk more about these in a coming slide. But the white grubs go through 3 sub-stages or instars. They get progressively larger. As they get larger, they're feeding more, causing more damage. They're going to overwinter down in the soil. They go down about 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 inches to avoid a hard frost. In spring, they come back up again in the soil. They feed a little bit, but then they pupate and transform to adults, and then we get that next generation the following year. So with Japanese beetles, there's only 1 generation per year, and the key time to remember is early July because that's when the adults are popping out. Let's look at the eggs quickly. So when the adults are out, they're mating. The females after mating are laying eggs, and the females don't lay all their eggs in one basket. Essentially, the females will lay a couple dozen eggs, maybe in the range of about 50 or so. It can vary 40 to 60 eggs in her lifespan. But what she does is she burrows down into the soil and will lay a small batch of eggs, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 eggs. Then she's going to come back above ground, and at some other future point in time, she's going to burrow back down into the soil, probably in a different spot, and lay some more eggs. So she's essentially scattering these eggs over space and over time, leading to sometimes widespread distribution of white grubs in the soil. Now, this egg laying is actually influenced by a number of different things. One factor that's been studied is the proximity of nearby food plants. So if you have a favorite food plant of the adult beetle, say a linden tree or some grape plants or rose bushes, and then you have nice turf grass right next to it, they've got everything they want or need. They've got adult food that they really love. And if there's a great place to lay eggs nearby, they often go to locations like that too. They also have some preferences in terms of ground cover. And it turns out that Japanese beetles are very, very fond of turf grass settings. So if you wanted to raise Japanese beetles, you'd want to go to a place like a golf course. You know, the definition of a golf course is pretty much acres and acres of low-cut irrigated turf grass. That's what Japanese beetles love. So they really do love turf grass, and they love home lawns as well. And then soil conditions can also influence Japanese beetle egg laying behavior. And we're going to come back and talk about this later on when we discuss management, because there are some things you can do in your home lawn that may influence egg laying and appearance of grubs and things like that. Now, once the females lay eggs in the soil, those eggs are going to sit there for about a week and a half to maybe 2 weeks before hatching. And so we're going to start getting our grubs usually in later July, and then have grubs present through late July, August, September, and October, and so on. So that's the egg stage. This is what the eggs actually look like. It would be hard to find these because they're just a millimeter or two long, ovalish, pale, and these would be down in the soil where the female laid them. In terms of the larval stages, the larvae we call white grubs. They look like this creature in the upper right-hand corner, except when mature, they're going to be about 3/4 of an inch long or so. They have a distinct white C-shaped body, and I will say that C-shape is distinctive. If you were to try and stretch them out straight, they're going to curve back in the C-shape. It has to do with the musculature of their body. However, there are other white grubs with that general appearance. I'll talk more about that in a second, how we can tell them apart. But white grubs are going to have that whitish C-shaped body. They're going to have an orange or brownish head capsule with mandibles or mouth parts they use to feed on plant roots. They also have 3 pairs of jointed legs. And these larvae or grubs of Japanese beetles, they're in the soil where you have plant roots. So again, typically locations such as turf grass, and they're going to be in about the upper 2 or so inches of soil, right where you have a lot of root density there. And that's what they're feeding on, is some of those plant roots. As those larvae develop, they go through 3 substages or instars. I'll show you a picture here momentarily. But the key way to identify a white grub as a Japanese beetle grub, you have to look at what's called the raster pattern. This is essentially the beetle butt, if you will. This is what I'm showing in this picture in the lower right-hand corner. So this would be if you grab the grub with your fingers and you kind of pry the C-shape open and you look at the back end of the thing. Japanese beetles have a pattern of spines and hairs, and they have this distinctive V-shaped pattern, which looks like kind of an opening zipper. That's very distinctive, and we can use that to distinguish Japanese beetle grubs from other species of grubs, such as harmless dung beetle grubs, Meijun beetle grubs, and so on. If it's a large grub, you can see the raster pattern with the naked eye. Otherwise, magnification helps. And this is what I was talking about with those larval substages or instars. So the grubs start out very small, just out of the egg. As they feed and grow and develop, they get progressively larger. They molt and go to a second instar grub. They molt and go to a third instar grub. And as they get larger and larger, they're feeding more. And as a result, they are causing more damage in the larger stage. Now let's look at the overwintering behavior of these grubs. So I mentioned earlier that the grubs are feeding in the upper 2 inches of the soil. So there they are hanging out. When the temperatures start to dip in the fall, our air temperatures are going to go down. The soil temperatures are gradually going to be going down as well. But when the soil temperature hits just under 60 degrees, about 15 Celsius, 59 Fahrenheit, that's a trigger. That tells the grubs winter is coming, get to a safe spot so you don't freeze to death. And what they do is they basically move their way down. So they're digging down into the soil until the soil temperature hits 50 degrees. At that point, they essentially become too lethargic to move, and they're just hanging out there for the rest of the winter. They may be 6 to 8 inches down, sometimes even 10 to 12 inches down as well. So then the snow comes, and we have our winter period, and the grubs are just hanging out protected below ground. Eventually the snow melts, and when the soil temperature finally hits 50 degrees again, that is their signal to move upwards. They're going to move up to that upper 2 to 3 inches again. feed for just a little bit more in the spring, and then they're going to pupate before transforming to the adult stage. So that's the overwintering behavior. Now you may be wondering about winter. Can winters actually kill Japanese beetles? And this is a very common question I get from the public. The short answer is yes, they can. But oh boy, it's got to be really cold for that to happen. Turns out the super cooling point of Japanese beetles is about 19 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you were to take a Japanese beetle grub in an experiment and get them to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, they're just going to freeze instantly. That, of course, is going to kill them. The problem is that when we have snow cover, that's a really good insulator. So the air temperature could be 0 degrees out, but that soil temperature, 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 inches below ground, might be in the mid-20s. And so that is really an important buffer that can protect them. However, I will say I've seen in the last decade some trends around the state. So if you think back, we had the brutal polar vortex the winter of 2013 to 2014. That following summer, most spots in the state, Japanese beetle populations seemed to be down. I also picked up a somewhat similar pattern last year. We had that brutal polar vortex the winter of 2018 to 2019. So with that said, can the cold winter kill them? Yes, if we do get a really cold, hard polar vortex, it can to a certain extent. But also when you think about horticulture, temperatures that cold can be really brutal on plants in general. So it might kill some beetles, it might kill some trees and shrubs as well. Now let's look at the pupae. So this is that intermediate stage between the larvae and the adult. They're really not doing a whole lot in terms of activity then. They're not moving around, they're not feeding. This is basically an internal transformation stage, if you will. They're rearranging all their larval tissues to form that adult beetle. This process takes about 2 weeks usually. It's going to be influenced by things like soil temperature. And then once they transform to the adults in the soil, they're going to stay in the soil. They basically have this small soil chamber called a cell. They're going to hang out in there for about 2 weeks before emerging above ground. And then we get our adult beetles. And this is why a lot of you are on the webinar today, because you want to know what to do about these. We're going to talk about management shortly. But just to recap, what is a Japanese beetle adult? Well, they are scarab beetles. They're just under 1/2 inch long, usually about 3/8 of an inch. They are a metallic green color with coppery brown or bronze wing covers, or elytra is the technical term for those. And they have a series, little tufts of whitish hairs running on the side of the body. So very distinctive in terms of their appearance. They'd really be pretty insects, beautiful to look at if they weren't so darn destructive. And these adults, again, can be long-lived. Once they emerge, they can easily live for a month, perhaps a month and a half, maybe even a little bit longer than that. So they're long-lived, meaning that we have a long period of the year, July, August, September, where we can see damage from these. And by the way, if you're curious, you can actually visually identify males from females. The females, her foreleg, there's a structure called a tibia. It has this rounded scoop-like structure. That's to help her dig into the soil so that she can lay eggs, whereas the male have kind of a hook or a tooth in that same area. You'd probably need a little bit of magnification to see this, but if you got good eyes, you can see it with the naked eye. Now, a little bit more about their behavior, and this is going to help us understand some of the management approaches we'll talk about here shortly, but just general mating behavior. This is true for a lot of insects and also Japanese beetles. It turns out that the male beetles actually emerge first, a little bit before the female. So it might be a day or a couple days beforehand. That way, when the females emerge, she is mated almost instantly. And it turns out that adult female Japanese beetles do produce a very potent sex pheromone. Basically, it's a chemical signal, basically a scent that draws in the males, and it's going to cause them to mate with her. So these females emerge, they're mated almost instantly. Sometimes you'll see a phenomenon called balling, where you look at your lawn and you see a ball or wad of 10 or 20 beetles together. That's probably one female with a bunch of males around her trying to mate with her. Over the course of their life, males will mate with multiple females to try and spread their genes, and females will also mate multiple times during her life to mix up the gene pool as well. Now, while they're mating, the males are pretty much preoccupied, but females, I will say, will continue to eat during this process. In terms of adult behavior, like their flight, this is of course influenced by environmental conditions. It's basically temperature dependent. If it's too cool, they're a little bit too lethargic and it's hard for them to fly. So temperatures generally need to be up about 70 degrees or warmer for them to fly. Although if it gets to be too hot, above about 95, Japanese beetles don't like to fly because it's very difficult on them physiologically. They don't have a good way to cool off. So most summer days though, this time of the year, if you have a decent day like this week, we've got some great Japanese beetle weather out there. They can be very active in flying around. They can fly some decent distances. I mentioned earlier, in a given day, they may fly 100 yards or a couple hundred yards, but in some cases, they can easily fly a mile, or they've been documented flying 5 miles or more in other situations. Weather can also influence their flight activity. If we've got a nice clear day, a sunny day, if there's not too much of a wind, we're going to see increased flight activity on those days, versus if it's kind of a crummy day out there, if it's really windy or if it's overcast, if it's rainy, they're not as active flying around on those types of days. In terms of adult feeding behavior, feeding is also influenced by environmental conditions. We know that peak Japanese beetle feeding is from about mid-morning into late afternoon, although I will say you can find them feeding in late afternoon into the evening hours as well. In general, in terms of their feeding, they like sunny areas and sunny plants. So what they tend to do is you could have two types of plants in your yard, like two rose bushes, same type of rose, same cultivar and all that. But if one is in a sunny spot and one's in a shady spot, the one that's in the sun is probably going to get more damage. So they often start at the sunny upper portions of plants, and then as they feed, more sunlight gets through. So essentially they work their way from the top downwards. And that's a very, very common theme that we see. If you look at the second photograph right here, you can see this particular tree. It's been fed on from the top down. And at this point, only about the lower 10 or 15% of the foliage still has green on it. And I suspect in that case, perhaps the entire tree was skeletonized. Now, in terms of the actual feeding damage, let's discuss the anatomy of the Japanese beetles briefly. So when it comes to insects and the type of feeding damage they can do, the anatomy that an individual insect has dictates what type of damage they can cause. And with both adults and larval Japanese beetles, they have chewing type mouth parts. So their mouth parts essentially work like a pair of scissors or a pair of pliers. It's hard to see in the adult photo here, but they've got mandibles that are present. We can see the mandibles very easily in this larval photo down here, this white grub. You can see those two black structures that meet at kind of the midline. Those basically work like pinchers. So when those insects are feeding with chewing mouth parts, they are essentially snipping off, ripping off, tearing off pieces of plant material. The adults are going to be doing this above ground. The larvae are going to be doing it below ground. In terms of the damage that adults cause, they tend to nibble very distinctively around the veins on plants. And we call this type of damage skeletonization. And so this is a very characteristic type of feeding damage. Not many insects cause this type of damage, so it makes it easy to pick out that it's Japanese beetles doing it. So on an individual leaf, they will skeletonize it, leaving behind a lace-like skeleton of the plant veins behind. But when you look at a plant as a whole, we have a phenomenon called bronzing. And this is essentially where the leaves have been entirely fed upon. But remember, those leaves aren't entirely gone. You still have those veins there, and the remnants of the leaves turn brownish or kind of bronzes. So on a individual leaf by leaf basis, we discuss skeletonization, but we can also get bronzing when you look at the overall plant. So that's the damage caused by the adults. Typically, they're feeding on foliage, but I will say they can feed on other plant structures. And if you have roses in your yard, you're very well aware of this. We know that Japanese beetles can feed directly on floral structures, such as the petals. They can also feed directly on fruits. We see that in the lower left-hand corner with the raspberries, and they can feed on other plant structures as well. Like on this picture on the right-hand side, we are seeing them feed directly on the silks of that corn. And if they clip off the silks on that corn, you're not going to get pollination. If you don't get pollination, you're not going to get kernel development inside that ear of corn. So this might be all the damage that is caused to that ear of corn, but when you open it up, there's no kernels present. So that's the type of damage that adults can cause. In terms of what they actually feed on, I mentioned this earlier, but adults feed on over 300 different types of plants from 79 plant families. And they feed on lots of different stuff from different types of settings. So landscape trees, and by the way, on this slide, I am pointing out some of their favorite plants. So if you have problems with Japanese beetles in your area, you might want to choose something else. If you choose a preferred plant, you know that you may be facing some tough challenges ahead. So some of their favorite landscape trees, things like lindens, certain maples like Japanese maples and other maples. Birches are one of their favorites, crab apples, and related plants as well. Some of the ornamental cherries, for example, certain types of elm trees and mountain ash can be fed on very extensively. There are landscape shrubs and flowers. Roses would be up at the top of their list. They also feed on milkweeds, which a lot of folks are planting for monarchs these days, euonymus, alders, zinnias, geraniums, and so on. They'll feed on a wide range of fruits, tree fruit, apples, and pears. They'll feed on the foliage. They can also feed on the fruits themselves. Same kind of thing with stone fruit, cherries and peaches and plums. They'll feed on the foliage. They can feed on the fruit themselves. They love raspberries. They love grapes. If you gave them a choice, grapes would probably be one in their top 5 preferred plants. So if you're growing grapes and you've got Japanese beetles around, you're going to have to deal with this insect at one point or another. And they can feed on other things like strawberries too. And then in the home garden, they can feed on a wide range of vegetable crops, things like beans, especially if you grow pole beans that can get to be 6, 8, or 10 feet tall. They love those. They like corn. They'll feed on various herbs like basil. They can feed on asparagus as well. So again, they can feed on an extremely wide range of different plants out there. Now, we also know when we look at plants in our yard, sometimes we see not just one beetle, but a whole bunch of beetles together. Now, it turns out when this happens, it's not because of a pheromone. The only pheromone that Japanese beetles produce is the female sex pheromone. And remember, she only produces that prior to mating. Once that female adult beetle has mated, she stops making that pheromone. So they don't have an aggregation pheromone to tell all their friends to come. Instead, there's a different explanation for it. This is essentially a phenomenon called the blood in the water phenomenon. We all know the stereotypical scenario of sharks in water. A little bit of blood draws them in, then they feed on a fish or something else. You get more blood, you get more sharks. It's a positive feedback loop. The same thing happens with Japanese beetles. You get one beetle that lands on a plant and starts to feed on that plant. When the plant is damaged, there are volatile chemicals present that then get released into the air. Well, that is very, very attractive to additional beetles. So that draws in more beetles. Then you get more plant damage, which releases more chemicals, which is going to draw in even more beetles. So this is really important to understand. This is also really important. It'll pop up again later when we talk about management. So people often ask, like, can you squish beetles, or is it going to release an aggregation pheromone? Well, they don't have an aggregation pheromone. So that's a common misunderstanding about these particular insects. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Grub damage, just to briefly show you what this looks like. So if those larvae or grubs are down in the soil feeding on roots of turf grass or other plants, they're going to be causing a bit of damage. If your lawn is generally happy and healthy, most lawns can tolerate quite a few grubs, 10 to maybe even upwards of 15 grubs per square foot, and your lawn might not show any symptoms at all. If the grubs are really bad, though, you're going to start to see irregular brown patches in your lawn. Now, I will point out, if you go out in your yard and you look at your lawn and you see irregular brownish patches, it doesn't mean that it's grubs. There could be other causes. There are other insects that can cause that. There are diseases that can cause that. You'd have to do some scouting, basically dig up some turf, look for the grubs and see, are they present. If the grubs are causing a lot of damage and that lawn is severely injured, you can basically take the turf and roll it back like a rug, because the roots that anchor the turf down have all been completely severed. So that can be really severe damage. The worst grub damage I've ever seen in the state, this was about 10 years ago for a research experiment down in southwestern Wisconsin. We had populations of about 100 to 110 grubs per square foot. At that point, the turf grass didn't look like turf grass. It looked like someone had sprinkled straw on the ground. And then if you poked around in the soil, there were just gazillions of grubs present. So that's kind of a worst case scenario. But most folks are going to have some grubs in your lawn, and you just never know it because they don't cause any problems. I will also mention, if you have grubs present, sometimes other animals will find them. This could be skunks, raccoons, turkeys. If you're in northern Wisconsin, that could even be something like a bear, get in and start feeding on those grubs, and the vertebrate damage might actually be worse than the grub damage itself. So if you look at this photo here on the lower right-hand corner, there were grubs present in this turf grass area, but this was actually animals getting in and feeding for those grubs. And those animals, well, they didn't fix their divots when they were done playing there. So that can be really problematic in that regard. All right, so let's switch gears and talk about management of Japanese beetles. Now, there's not one set plan that everyone can use. So you got to customize this based on a bunch of factors in your yard. There are many factors that can influence management approaches, such as how much free time do you have? This year, 2020, is rather unique with COVID going on. A lot of us are home, so we have time to maybe buzz out and knock beetles off of plants and hand pick them. Whereas in a normal year, we might be at work during most of the day, and that isn't an option. So you have to ask yourself, how much free time do you have? How much time are you at home during those peak feeding hours of mid-morning through late afternoon? You also have to ask yourself, how many plants are affected? Is it 2 rose bushes, or do you have 200 rose bushes? That's going to influence what type of management approaches you can use. How big are the plants? Is it a 3-foot tall rose bush, or is it a 60-foot tall linden tree? That's going to impact what type of management approaches you can do. And also, how large of an area? Are you in an urban yard that's a 1/4 acre or 1/2 acre size? Or are you out in the country and you've got 5 acres of gardens? That's going to influence what type of approaches you can use. And then there's also personal preferences. Some folks have very certain preferences in terms of aesthetics. They just don't want to tolerate any plant damage at all. Some folks may kind of roll with things, and as long as the plants aren't going to be killed with it, they're less likely to do something. Some folks want to do organic. Some folks doesn't matter too much, and they'll do conventional things. So you have to think about all these different factors as we go through these different management approaches. And in my mind, when it comes to dealing with Japanese beetles on plants, I really break things down into 3 different scenarios. And it helps to think of things that way. Turf grass, so if we're concerned about grubs damaging our lawn, that's one scenario. Small plants that are maybe a foot or 2 or 3 feet tall, or even small trees that we could feasibly spray. There are some things we can do in cases like that. And then large plants, trees that are simply too big for us to spray. We have some different management approaches. So I'm going to be going through each of these in detail in the coming slides. Now, in terms of overall management approaches, there are 4 main different types of approaches, and we're going to talk about these individually and give you some concrete examples of what you can do in your own yard. We've got cultural control. These are basically decisions you can do in your yard. Physical control, using traps and physically picking them off of plants and things like that. We'll talk about biological control, which there are some things out there, but they don't seem to do too much. And then last but not least, we'll discuss chemical control as well, both conventional and organic options out there. So let's look at cultural practices. These are things you can manipulate in the local environment to prevent pest problems or to reduce the amount of damage. So things such as plant location in the landscape. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that Japanese beetles really love sunny locations. So if you are going to be putting in a new shrub or a new tree, and if you put it in full sun versus a spot that gets partial shade, that may influence how much damage that particular plant gets. Now, you have to keep in mind that each plant has an ideal spot it wants to go in. If you have a plant that needs full sun and you put that in a full shade location, that plant just isn't going to do any well. So don't disregard that. You have to keep that in mind. Sometimes could we try choosing less preferred plants? Yeah, that's true to a certain extent, but remember, Japanese beetles feed on over 300 different types of plants. We know they don't really like things like conifers, some evergreens like boxwood and stuff like that. Even within types of plants like birches, there are different varieties and cultivars. Same kind of thing for maples and elms, where certain cultivars really get clobbered by Japanese beetles and other ones don't get nibbled on as much. So before you're putting in plants, hop online, do some research to see if you can choose one that might be less preferred. There's also some things we can do in terms of lawn care and general tolerance. I'll talk about those in the next couple of slides. So let's look at lawn care. Turns out you can do an awful lot in your lawn to help prevent issues and run-ins with Japanese beetle grubs. So general good lawn care practices, things like good fertility. If you have a lawn that is getting fertilized properly and you have a dense lawn, that's going to be able to tolerate and recover from grub damage. We know that fertilizing at certain times of the year, like in fall when we have good growing conditions, can help a lawn recover if you did have some damage. Some other things we can do in our own yard, setting the cutting height on the mower a little bit higher. We know that in general, the turf grass root mass, the depth is going to be proportional to mowing height. So if we are cutting our grass really short at 1.5 or 2 inches, we're not going to have a very deep or robust root system. And if we don't have robust root system, it doesn't take much grub damage before we start seeing brown patches in our lawn. Versus if we're mowing at a higher setting, 3.5, 4 inches, yeah, it might be a little bit on the shaggier side, but you're going to have deeper roots. That deeper, more robust root system can tolerate some grub damage or tolerate more grub damage. So mowing at a higher height, also making sure to have nice sharp mower blades so you're not ripping and shredding and stressing the turf. That can be very helpful as well. There's also some things we can do in terms of modifying our irrigation practices. So it's been studied that Japanese beetles have certain preferences when it comes to soil moisture. If you have a lawn that has gone dormant because it's very hot and dry and it's got a low moisture level, the females don't like that because they can sense that that would not be a good environment for the larvae to develop in. Versus if you have a lawn that is nice and lush and green and getting lots of moisture, that is a lawn that may be more likely a spot for the females to go and lay eggs. So imagine a scenario like 2012. If you think back to the year 2012, that was a pretty dry, drouthy year for many parts of Wisconsin, and a lot of lawns naturally went dormant. That's what a turf grass species do. Well, if you had a dormant lawn, the female Japanese beetles probably aren't very likely to go there. But if you were the house on your block that was irrigating all summer to have that lush green lawn during the drought, that could really kind of put a bullseye on your lawn. So sometimes modifying irrigation practices can impact where the females are going to go to lay their eggs. We can also modify irrigation another way. If we are irrigating, if there were a dry spell in, say, September or October, when grubs are starting to cause significant amount of damage, we can help the turf grass recover by irrigating then. So these are some cultural things we can do. We're not using any pesticide or anything to help the lawn recover on its own. We can also sometimes just tolerate beetles, their grub presence, the adult presence, but this comes down to a matter of personal preference. Some folks just don't want to tolerate any insect damage on their plants. Other folks kind of say, well, if it's not going to kill the tree, I can roll with the punches here. As I said earlier, healthy lawn can tolerate 10 to maybe 12 or 15 grubs per square foot. And if you do bump into some grub damage, well, you could always reseed. And so lots of folks that take that approach where they don't feel the need to treat their lawn for grubs because the lawn typically tolerates it. And if they get some damage, they can fix it by reseeding in late summer or in the fall. Also, if you think about trees and shrubs, they can really take quite a beating and do just fine. If you have a tree or shrub that's in good health, if it gets completely defoliated this year, it's almost certainly going to leaf out again next year. When that starts happening year after year and we get regular defoliation, that's when I start to get a little bit more nervous. So trees can withstand occasional defoliation. Also keep in mind that a lot of plants put out an overabundance of leaves, and they can really tolerate quite a bit of damage. We don't have thresholds per se for landscape trees and shrubs. Thresholds are more of an economic thing, but if you think of plants like soybeans in a farmer's field or grapes in a vineyard, they can often go with a damage threshold of about 30%. What that means is those farmers and growers can tolerate 30% damage, 30% leaf loss, and their yield isn't affected at all. So keep that in mind, that plants can really tolerate a fair amount of damage before it will actually impact yield of fruits and vegetables or impact the overall health of plants. There's some other things we can do in terms of physical control. So these are physical activities that you can go out and do to help remove or reduce pest population. These are things like hand picking, squishing them, knocking them into a container of soapy water, using barriers, mesh screen, and things like that, and also using traps as well. So one of the first and foremost things, and everyone can do this, but again, it depends on your individual situation. How many plants are we talking about? How much free time do you have? But this can be a very viable option, especially a year like 2020, where a lot of us are home due to COVID. So we can go out, we can hand pick them. You could do this multiple times per day if you want. You can pick them, you can squish them, you can knock them into a container of soapy water if you want. The problem, and this is a limitation of this approach, there's no residual protection. So if you bump a Japanese beetle and you didn't grab it and it flies off, it may land 5 minutes later as soon as you've left. So keep that in mind. But this is an option. It turns out it can actually work pretty well if you have the time and patience to do it. Now, in terms of the behavior of Japanese beetles, if you're trying to grab them or knock them into a container of soapy water, it depends on the temperature a little bit. Sometimes they fly, sometimes they drop. If it's cooler, below about 74 degrees Fahrenheit, they tend to fall or tumble or drop down. If it's warmer than about 77, then most of the time they're going to be flying. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. They're trying to evade capture, so keep that in mind. Now, another common misconception, again, this is a common question. If you have squished or drowned some Japanese beetles, is it okay to dump them in your yard when you are done? And the answer to that is yes. Remember that the only pheromone Japanese beetles produce is the female sex pheromone. She only makes that until she mates. Once she mates, she stops producing that pheromone. So if you are catching beetles, they have almost certainly, the females most likely have mated already, and they don't have an aggregation pheromone. So you can squish them or drown them in soapy water, and you can dump them in your yard when you're done. You could put them in compost. You can put them in the trash if you want, but it's okay to dump them out in your yard. They will not be releasing a pheromone from the dead beetles. Now, you may be wondering, this is a lot of work. If I go out and I pick beetles every day, will it actually make a difference? And folks had this question for a long time, and it was studied in a scientific research study. And it turns out that yes, especially if you do this starting early in the season before they cause significant damage, this can be very helpful. So remember that blood in the water phenomenon I talked about earlier. The reason beetles get attracted to plants in large numbers is they feed, it releases chemicals from the plant, that draws in more, which attracts more beetles. They cause more damage. You get more beetles, and on and on and on. It's a positive feedback loop. So even going out once a day is what this study found. If you reduce that initial feeding damage and those plants aren't putting out these volatile chemicals, you're not drawing in nearly as many. So yes, hand removal can make a difference, and it's been backed up with research data. Let's talk about barrier and row cover. So these are physical things that you can do, basically using a mesh screening or floating row cover of some kind. This is a physical barrier between the plant and the insects. There are some really important considerations though. Plant size. If you have a 10-foot tall tree, it's just going to be really difficult to put a big mesh bag over it and get it sealed around. We also have plants that need pollinator access. So if you have something like raspberry plants or bean plants where you need insects to go in and pollinate those flowers, well, if you have a mesh screen over it, the pollinators can't get in. So it won't really work well in that regard. Versus other plants like herbs. Let's say you're growing a basil plant, and Japanese beetles like to feed on basil. If you covered the basil with a little bit of mesh screening, that's going to physically keep the insects off of it. So there are some options where this may be a viable management approach. And then also you have to consider aesthetics. If the point of having a rose bush is to look at the rose flowers, and you're going to cover it with a big mesh sheet or something like that, and you can't see the flowers anymore, it kind of defeats the purpose. So again, this isn't a magic cure-all approach, but there are certain situations where it can work very well. Now, these traps, and I know this is a situation that a lot of folks act about. So there are traps available. You can find them at pretty much every hardware store out there. And there's a lot of research starting in about the 1960s and 70s about these. And the traps contain the synthetic version of the female sex pheromone, so that can attract males. It also increases, or it has some floral chemicals that can draw in the beetles, both sexes, because it basically mimics those plant volatiles being released from damaged plants. Now, The question you may be wondering is, do they actually work? And it turns out there's a lot of myths and misconceptions. And some of the early research from the 60s and 70s from groups like USDA was very encouraging. And folks thought that, yes, these are good management approaches. However, more recent research has come out to change our views about that. And it turns out some of the older research still gets quoted sometimes on company websites where they sell these traps, saying it's a great option. But it turns out newer data show that they don't work in terms of preventing plant damage. Do they work if you want to catch a lot of Japanese beetles? Yes. But it turns out that if you have Japanese beetle traps in your yard, you tend to see increased plant damage. The reason for that is these traps are not a magic black hole that's going to suck in every beetle. Instead, you're only capturing a fraction of the beetles in the area. So we get what we call a spillover effect. You get lots of beetles that are drawn in. They don't go to the trap. They just land on nearby plants and start feeding. And so as a result, through several research studies, it's been determined that if you have traps in your yard, you end up seeing increase in plant damage. So we do not recommend using these traps. And that's a very common misconception. Traps get hyped up a lot online, but the scientific data shows that they do not work at preventing plant damage. You tend to get more damage. All right, let's look at biological control. So this is basically using natural enemies, predators and parasites to help control pests. Another way to think of that is using Mother Nature to help out. So predators, parasites, disease pathogens, and so on. There are some predators out there. Ants in the soil are a very common predator of Japanese beetle larvae. There are predatory ground beetles as well. We know birds, like some chickens, will feed on them. Although I have not seen any data to suggest that getting a flock of chickens will necessarily protect or really minimize that much plant damage in your yard. But hey, if you have chickens, yes, they will indeed feed on them. We also have certain mammals that will feed on them. Although if you have a lot of grubs around, I don't know if you necessarily want to have skunks around. If you're like me and you have 2 black labs, 1 skunk encounter is enough for a lifetime. All right, so these vertebrates, and I mentioned this earlier, vertebrates can actually do a surprisingly good job at feeding on some of the life stages like the larvae. So this is from a USDA technical bulletin from a couple decades ago. Here it says the starlings reduced the grub population in one lawn from about 100 per square foot to 5 or 6 within a few days. So that's some fast results. The crows, instead of extracting the grubs through small holes, frequently pull up small pieces of turf and scatter them over a lawn. So think about that. Yes, you can have grubs, but if you have vertebrates present, they may cause additional damage. So sometimes that solution might be worse than the actual problem that's present. In terms of other biological controls, there are parasitoid wasps from the genus Typhia that attack them. There are entomopathogenic or insect-killing nematodes. There are tachinid flies that will attack Japanese beetles. This fly, the winsome fly, lays a whitish egg right behind the head of Japanese beetle. That egg's going to hatch. That fly maggot will burrow its way inside that beetle and kill it from the inside. So there are some of these things out there. They don't seem to have that much of an overall impact, though. There are also some diseases. I'll talk more about these in a little bit. Things like milky spore disease, which is a bacteria. There's also a fungal disease called metarhizium that's out there as well. Now let's talk about chemical controls, because I realize we're getting short on time here. But I spelled this out earlier, the different management scenarios. We got turf grass, we have small plants, trees and shrubs and garden plants. We've got large plants such as large trees. Each of these approaches needs different products and tactics. Also keep in mind that targeting one life stage, say targeting the grubs, really isn't going to impact having adult beetles in your yard. So you have to keep that in mind. So I always remind folks to focus on the plants you're trying to protect. I get a lot of calls and emails. Folks think they're going to kill the grubs in their lawn so that they won't have adult beetles next year. It doesn't work like that. So that's a common misconception. Also, when I'm mentioning products or active ingredients, I'm not endorsing anything over another. I simply want to mention what's out there. So to control grubs in lawn settings, this would be a case where we are worried about grub damage to our lawn. You don't want to do this to try and prevent adult beetles. It doesn't work in that way. There's 2 approaches, a preventative approach. This is a proactive approach you do ahead of time. This is basically a treatment you do before the grubs are even present, which these treatments can work very well, but you have to ask yourself, is it needed? Most lawns have grubs and never have any issues. So this comes down to personal preference and aesthetics, for example. Then we have the curative approach. This is a situation where you didn't do a preventative grub treatment, but all of a sudden in September, you realize you've got some major grub issues. We could go out and kind of do a rescue or reactionary treatment at that time in response to the presence of grubs. Now, one really important thing, regardless of the approach, you need to water the products into the lawn to get down to those 2 or 3 inches below the soil where those grubs are. If you don't water products in, they're not going to work. In terms of preventative grub control, these are applied early in the season, basically around the time or before egg hatch. They're long-lasting products. They can last usually several months, but these products do provide excellent control of white grubs. We're talking 90 to 100% control, but they work best against small grubs. If you use these products against big grubs, in most cases, they don't work. The thing is, there's not that many different products out there. These are the product ingredients listed here. The two in blue are from the diamide class. These are newer products. What's nice about these is they're highly specific to insects. They target the mussels, and they're relatively soft on bees. So we can protect pollinators more using these, versus the lower 4 are neonicotinoids, which we've heard about in the news. These neonicotinoids can pose risk to bees if they're exposed to it, and that's really important to keep in mind. Bees would have to be exposed to these chemicals. I will also point out these two at the very bottom, clothianidin and thiamethoxam, they have preventative and curative properties, so keep that in mind. I do want to point out briefly, if you are planning to treat your lawn for grubs, even if we use neonicotinoids, there are a number of different things you can do to minimize risk to bees. We can choose non-neonicotinoid products. We can control weeds. If we don't have blooming dandelions and clover in our lawn, then we shouldn't have bees there, so we can minimize risks that way. Scientific studies have also found that using granular products or mowing and clipping off the flower heads on weeds before treating a lawn can also minimize risk. So those are some important things that you can do in your own home lawn. Now let's talk briefly about curative grub control. So I said earlier, this is more of a reactionary approach. So you didn't treat your lawn preventatively, but all of a sudden in September, you realize I've got some pretty bad grub damage. What can I do about it? You can use these curative grub controls. These products have short residual activity. So instead of lasting for months and months, the conventional products maybe break down within about a week or week and a half. Also, it's really hard to kill big grubs. So the sooner you catch the grubs and treat them, the better control you're going to get. If you just have huge third instar grubs, no matter what you're using, it's going to be hard to control them. So if you go to the hardware store, you can find products like Carbaryl, some of the older formulations of 7 you can get granular. I will caution you though, the product 7, which usually comes in a red container, has changed ingredients in the last year or two. And the new ingredient is a pyrethroid, which does not work well at all against grubs. So you'd have to find the ingredient Carbaryl. Also the ingredient trichlorphan, sometimes in a product called Dilox. There's other products out there at most hardware stores. Those are 2 of our best curative grub controls. Now, there are some organic options out there for grub control. One of the best ones would be Bacillus thuringiensis gallery. This is a strain of BT that specifically targets beetles. And there's a newer product out there called Grub Gone, which contains this ingredient, and it can do a decent job at targeting the white grub stage. There's also entomopathogenic nematodes, milky spore, and that fungal disease metarhizium can be found in products. Now, one thing in particular I want to address, I see lots of folks hyping up milky spore. However, when it's been reviewed and looked at in scientific studies, it works very, very poorly. So I know lots of folks hype that up, but the scientific data suggest it works very, very poorly at providing control. Also keep in mind, if you are trying to treat your lawn to prevent having adult beetles, keep in mind it doesn't quite work like that. So that's how we can treat grubs in our yard. Now, in terms of timing grub control, remember the adult beetles come out in early July, so they're laying eggs in July and early August. So if we're doing a preventative treatment, we need it to be out before that. So we're talking late May, June, July, any time in there should give you good control. Versus those curative treatments, the earlier we do those and the smaller the grubs are, the better control we'll get. So we're talking August, Most cases, though, folks don't realize they've got grub damage until September or October. Those grubs at that point are larger and harder to kill. And then let's talk about controlling Japanese beetles on above ground plants. So let's talk about small plants. These are shrubs, flowers, garden vegetables, and things like that. Typically, we are using foliar applications of insecticides. There are conventional products, there are organic products. I will mention for these conventional products, these are some of the commonest active ingredients out there. So when you look at the product container, these are what is actually in the fine print that's contained in that product. You have to keep in mind that most of these products are very broad spectrum, so spraying them on flowers like a flowering rose bush could pose risk to pollinators. They also have short residual activity. These conventional products break down within about a week or two, but they can work very well. We do have some organic options, insecticidal soap and horticultural oils like neem oil. I'll talk more about those in just a moment. We have some other options as well, azadirachtin, pyrethrins. There's also that newer Bacillus thuringiensis Gallery, which for a foliar spray can be found in a product called Beetle Gone that can work very well, and that's an organic option. So again, there's a lot of different sprays out there you can get at the hardware store. These have been backed up with scientific studies. In most cases, they work pretty well. However, I do want to talk about the pros and cons of these. So let's look at the conventional sprays. If you get a product from the hardware store, like a 7 or a pyrethrid of some kind, if you spray that on plant foliage, you are basically creating a protective coating on those leaves or other plant structures. If you miss a spot, you forget to do one side of the tree or one side of the shrub, that side of the plant is not protected. Also, new growth is not protected. So if I spray a rose bush today and those blooms open tomorrow or those buds open tomorrow and I've got blooms, those plant structures are not protected. So you have to keep that in mind. That is a limitation of these products. They also work for about a week or two at a time. These conventional products do work very well, but you essentially have to spray and then a week or two later reassess and see, are the insects going back and damaging those plants? If so, you may need to reapply. So you may need to do this multiple times through July, August, and into September, about every week to 2 weeks, depending on how active the beetles are. Last but not least, you have to keep in mind that these conventional sprays are very broad spectrum product. They'll kill just about any insect, good or bad. So if you are spraying plants with flowers on them, and it's a type of flower that is attractive to bees or other pollinators like flies, butterflies, moths, other beetles, for example, if you spray those flowers, those pollinators will be at risk. Also, when you're looking at formulations, you can get a liquid spray versus a powder. If you are putting out a powder type product, bees have evolved specifically to pick up pollen, which is a small fine powder. So if you're using a dust or powder type product, that may increase risk for pollinators. So try to go with a liquid type spray that you can get good coverage with. Let's look at some of these organic sprays. So I mentioned insecticidal soap and horticultural oils. These often get some use for Japanese beetles. However, I really want to point out that they have very limited impact. When you look at these in research studies, they tend to work very poorly. They only kill by direct contact. They also have a very short residual. Basically, once they're dry, they're done working. You can spray Japanese beetles with insecticidal soap. It may kind of stun them. They may tumble off of plants, but there's a good chance that they may kind of come to at a later point in time. So those don't necessarily work very well. If you want something that works better, some organic options would be things like azadirachtin. This has shown a lot of good results in research studies. Azadirachtin itself has anti-fedant properties, and it can also work for several days, somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 days in a lot of situations. Now, you may be thinking neem versus azadirachtin. What's up with that? I'll talk about that on the next slide. Other organic options, we've got pyrethrins. These work very, very quickly. Pyrethrins are a natural extract from certain types of chrysanthemums that happen to have insecticidal properties. They are very, very potent. They also have repellent properties, so they can work fairly well in that regard, and they do get used in organic agriculture for Japanese beetles. However, they break down very quickly in sunlight, basically within a day. So if you're using pyrethrins and the Japanese beetles are bad, you may have to spray not just repeatedly, but potentially repeatedly within a given week. So that's a lot of spraying. Pyrethrins are also extremely broad spectrum. Yes, they can kill Japanese beetle, but pyrethrins can also kill bees and other beneficial creatures. So if you are spraying a lot and getting drift, that can pose risk to pollinators. So just because something is organic doesn't mean that it's safe for bees and other pollinators. And then last but not least, if you want a good organic option, there are some newer products out there like the product Beetle Gone, which has been shown in some studies to work well against Japanese beetle adults. It contains the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis, but it's the Gallery strain, and that's very important. If you go to the hardware store, you'll find the Kerstaki strain, Bacillus thuringiensis kerstaki. This is a different strain, Bacillus thuringiensis Gallery. Again, it's in the product called Beetle Gone, which personally I have not seen at a hardware store. You probably have to order it online. This is basically a bacteria that works as a stomach poison, and I have seen some good results in research trials about 8 to 10 years ago in a different position on campus. I did research myself with that particular product or ingredient, Bacillus thuringiensis Gallery, with good results both in choice and no choice experiments against Japanese beetles. So these are some organic options, but back to the neem versus azadirachtin. So there's a plant called the neem tree. If you press the seeds, you get neem oil. However, when they refine the oil, they get two ingredients, azadirachtin, and then you get neem oil. And there's a common misconception about this, and I hear a lot of folks hype up using neem oil for Japanese beetle. Neem oil itself is essentially a waste product or byproduct once you extract the azadirachtin from it. Azadirachtin itself actually has multiple insecticidal properties. It's an anti-fedant, it's a repellent, it has growth regulator properties, and it can really impact insects in a number of different ways. And studies have backed up that azadirachtin can work against Japanese beetles. However, what is often sold at stores is something like this, neem oil. Well, if you look at the active ingredient down here, it says clarified hydrophobic extract of neem oil. Again, that's basically the byproduct after the good stuff, azadirachtin, has been taken out. This neem oil is going to work about the same as cooking oil in terms of how effective it will be against Japanese beetles. It might stun them a bit. It's not going to work particularly well, but you can find some specific organic products that contain azadirachtin. If you find products containing azadirachtin, they're going to work much better than neem oil. So again, a lot of folks have a misconception that neem oil is this magical substance you can put on a pedestal, but it's really the azadirachtin that is going to work much better, and that's what the science has said. And then just to wrap up, I know I've gone over by a little bit, but I want to talk about large trees. We also use these same approaches for certain shrubs. If you have a large tree, it's too big to spray. In some cases, we can do a preventative systemic application. This would be applied to the soil, ingredients like imidacloprid, but keep in mind imidacloprid belongs to the neonicotinoid group. And neonicotinoids, many of them can be toxic to bees, so we have some concerns there. They also take a while for uptake. It can take several weeks to move up from the soil through the roots up to the foliage of the tree. So you would need to do this in like sometime in June before the Japanese beetles come out. So if you have like a birch tree, this can be an option. We do this systemic approach sometimes with certain shrubs. There's products sold for roses, for example. But again, keep in mind, these products can pose risks to bees if it's a plant that's attractive to bees. Some things you can do to minimize risks: if you wait until after the plants have bloomed before you apply this product, that can reduce or minimize risk to bees. I also want to point out that if you have a big linden tree, these options have basically been taken off the table because of concerns with pollinators. It turns out there have been several bee kill incidents, and the EPA has now required this information on many of those products, a little bee box, red diamond with a cartoon bee in it, and it will have this statement: do not apply this product by any application method to linden, basswood, or other Tilia species. What that means is that if you were to use these systemic products on a linden tree, you'd be violating federal law. So you just can't do it. So we have these options for certain trees like birches, rose shrubs, and things like that, but we don't have a great option for large linden trees, for example. So if you do have a large tree, One consideration is to hire an arborist to come out and do an assessment, because arborists have some additional options that are not available for homeowners. And with that said, I apologize. I have gone over by about 5-10 minutes, so I realize some folks might have had to duck out, but that wraps up my whirlwind tour of Japanese beetles, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, PJ. I think we have a ton of questions, and a lot of them were answered throughout the talk. So I have, let me see here. I'm just paging through my notes. So a couple questions that came up in regards to fruit. Is the fruit safe to eat after feeding by Japanese beetles?
Yeah, as far as I know, I have not heard of any concerns in that regard. There are plenty of insects that feed on fruit themselves. So when Japanese beetles feed on, say, something like an apple, they're usually just chewing small divots on the surface of the fruit, not going terribly deep. So it's not a whole lot of damage. But again, I haven't heard of any like human consumption health issues with that. Now, if you had a fruit that was nibbled on by Japanese beetles and that opened up a wound, and then you get growth of bacteria and fungi in there, that sort of thing, then that may be more of an issue.
Okay. Another question. Well, there was quite a few questions about in regards to lawns and treating your lawn. So I'm going to ask you a series here. Maybe you can lump the answer together. Are there any lawn grasses that discourage grubs or beetles, or that they don't like? It's one of them. If I treat my lawn and my neighbors don't treat their lawn, like will they flock to my area, or how does that work? And then in addition to that one, do the Japanese beetles, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but do they stay or very close to where they were young grubs? Or do they, I know you said they go like I think 5 mile radius maybe. So maybe you already answered that one. Let's see. And then there was a couple other questions about lawn care and fertilizer.
Okay. So the first one I think was basically, are there turf grasses that they don't like as much? And none that I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, the typical turf grasses we're using here in Wisconsin, Kentucky bluegrass, some of the fescues and things like that. As far as I know, it's not so much the specific turf species. It's the females can use some visual cues and some other cues as well, but they'll realize that, hey, we've got a nice stand of green plant material, and they go and check out the moisture and can lay eggs there. I will point out that they don't always lay eggs in turf grass areas. Sometimes it's other areas that have other vegetation present. So it's not necessarily turf grass, but they're recognizing there's some green plants here, and if the soil moisture is good, occasionally they'll lay eggs in the soil beneath vegetables and gardens and things like that.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on why, if someone hadn't experienced Japanese beetles in their garden before for quite a few years, why they would be showing up now? Is there increased pressure, or what are we seeing on that side?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we do see an awful lot of variability from year to year around the state and around the Midwest and really the eastern part of the US in terms of how high beetle populations are. And there's a lot of factors at play. Weather is going to play an important factor, both temperatures, but also moisture and rainfall and things like that. In terms of like a given spot in Wisconsin, if you have never seen Japanese beetles before, it may just be that they've moved into your area. We do also see some times where when Japanese beetles first get into a given location in the state, they can be really pretty bad and really damaging for several years. And then over time, things kind of fizzle out a little bit where their numbers don't seem as high. Is it some natural buildup of predators or parasites, something along those lines? That may be part of the equation, but overall, we do see an awful lot of variation over the years.
And then I'll just ask one or two more here. There's been a couple questions about removing damaged either flowers or foliage. Will that help if you remove it, or what are your suggestions on that?
Well, that's a good question. I have not seen any research studies specifically on that. Like if you have a leaf with some damage and you remove that, does that help or hurt in the long run? So I can't speak in that regard. I just haven't seen any studies that looked at it. In general, and I mentioned this earlier, the smaller the amount of plant damage, that's going to be best overall for the plant. Because if we start getting more nibbling and skeletonization, that's going to release those plant volatiles. That will attract more beetles, which can cause more damage. So it may also depend on how big are the plant parts you're removing. Because simply removing some of the damaged leaves, that is going to be releasing some volatiles from the plant as well. So I haven't seen a good study looking at that particular question.
Okay, thanks, PJ. Diana or Jay, do you have any other questions you'd like to throw out there? I know we're over on time here, so.
Thanks, Andrea. So PJ, one other question that's come back is diatomaceous earth. And I don't know if you know anything about that. My understanding is you put it on the plants and then the beetles don't want to feed on them because they don't want to eat that stuff. But do you know anything about, has there been any research on that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I purposely didn't include that one because generally when I chat with my colleagues at professional meetings and stuff like that, diatomaceous earth has come up several times for Japanese beetles. And when folks have used it in experiments, they just haven't found it working very well, if at all. I know that's another thing that kind of gets hyped up and they sell it and folks use it for a wide range of things. But outdoors, I don't view diatomaceous earth working very well. It does see some very specific use indoors in dry conditions to control things like bed bugs and stuff like that. But outdoors with moisture and rainfall, I wouldn't expect it to work very well. Also, I mentioned this, but if you're using a dust or powder type product, if it's a plant that's attractive to bees, or if bees or other pollinators land on that, they may end up picking some of that up with the little hairs on their body. So that could pose some risks as pollinators. So I generally don't recommend diatomaceous earth for Japanese beetles because the data I've seen suggests it just doesn't work very well.
Thank you, PJ. One more question and then we can move on. There's been a couple questions about geraniums and maybe they cause the Japanese beetles to become quote unquote drunk or put them in a paralyzed state. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting phenomenon. I didn't have chance to include that in my talk. There has been a paper published on that, and it's not just geraniums as a whole. There's a specific type of geranium. I want to say it's zonal geranium, but I'd have to double check on that. And these particular types of geraniums have a chemical in their leaves that the beetles like to feed on these plants, but the chemical in there basically intoxicates them. So they kind of fall off the plant or they fall over on their back and they're out of it for a while. My understanding is they will eventually come to, but if they're lying there, they may be vulnerable to attack by birds or other insects or some other animal out there. But in terms of using those geraniums for a management approach, I haven't heard anything in that regard. So I wouldn't go out there and just start putting a bunch of geraniums thinking that's going to help control them.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and I think it answered a lot of questions for folks that are spending more time in their yards these days.